My name is Brian Swett from the city of Boston, and again, extend my welcome to those of you who weren't here last night from Mayor Marty Walsh. He's very excited that this conference is here and here now. I'm going to focus a bit and give you a little bit more background on what Boston is doing to get climate prepared. And I know the focus of the sessions this morning is around public-private partnerships. And I also want to talk about the critical partnerships between local and state government, being where you all are coming from. And this really is a critical local, and the mayor emphasized this last night, this issue in particular needs local, state, federal, and regional coordination and cooperation. So I always like to start these presentations by showing the slides that keep me up at night in the hope that other people will stay up at night with me worried about this stuff. This is, and my guess is, and actually I should have, for some of the folks from Canada in here, should have included some of the Canadian provinces in this. My guess is the Canadian map looks similar to this. This is the map of 2012 temperature in the US. The part that's concerning is both the average temperature, and 2012 was the warmest year on record by a full degree Fahrenheit. But it's also that there is no blue on this map. There's a tiny little bit of blue up here on the coast of Oregon and Washington. Outside of that, the rest of the country had either an average or above average year. That is really problematic. And as folks know, we've had anywhere between 12 of the hottest years on record in the last 15, or depending on how far you go. This is not an anomaly year. This is a trend that is very concerning. I'm going to focus a lot, given the focus of this conference, on coastal issues associated with climate change. But in Boston here, we are equally concerned about urban heat island effect and extreme heat waves. Heat events cause more deaths in this country than any other natural hazard combined. And so it is extended periods of heat, which we expect to have more of going forward, is the silent killer, right? It gets much less noise and much less press than hurricanes, than flooding events. But it is by far the greatest public health issue we have associated with climate change. So we know on average in Boston from 1961 to 1990, we experienced about 1 day over 100 degrees Fahrenheit a year. And from 2070 to 2099, we're expecting between 6 and 24. And that is dependent on CO2 in the atmosphere and on the various ranges between our emission standards. 24 days a year above 100 degrees Fahrenheit is a fundamentally different climate in New England than we have today. And it is a climate, frankly, that we are not prepared for from a building perspective, from an infrastructure perspective, or from a neighborhood perspective. And that is within the lifetime of folks who are with us today, right? That is within the current generation of kids that are in elementary school today. We know the seas are rising. This is from the tide gauge in Boston. Since 1920, we've experienced about 10 inches of sea level rise at the Boston tide gauge. About half of that is actually from land subsidence, and half of that is from sea level rise. Between now and 2050, we expect another 6 to 16 inches of sea level rise. And between now and 2100, we expect between 2 and 6 feet. 6 feet is a game changer. And this is, as folks know and can appreciate, and where you were last night, that is made land. A significant portion of Boston is on filled tidelands. And it was filled to be protective of high tides several hundred years ago. So if you add 2 to 6 feet, it is problematic. So this is Boston in 1630. This is why we're referred to as the Shawmut Peninsula. The very narrow isthmus there is about Washington Street in the south end. And it used to be, Tremont Street actually is for 3 mountains, and there used to be 3 mountains on the Shawmut Peninsula. 2 of those were actually, the soil was used to create filled tidelands. So this is where we are today, and essentially today we're about here, in that area. And you can see that much of the financial district is on filled tidelands, much of the Back Bay and the South End. Pretty much anything that has a water-based word in its name was once water. Bay Village, which is in between the South End and the Back Bay, much of the South Boston waterfront, much of East Boston, our entire airport is on filled tidelands, much of what we consider Charleston today. So this is how Boston has grown, by building on filled tidelands. And this is the do-nothing scenario, right? Folks often ask, okay, what is the cost of getting prepared? Well, what's the cost of not getting prepared? The real estate value assets that Boston has at risk today from flooding puts us number 4 in the country, after New York, Miami, and New Orleans. That's not a list I want to be in the top 10 on, right? So that is real estate value at risk from flooding today from natural hazard events. And we know, we've been a city that's been living with water since we've been founded. So the top left is Winter Storm Hercules. I love that now that NEMA and FEMA is just naming every storm. So it dumped about a foot of snow. This was our New Year's Eve storm this year, or New Year's Day storm. This is Christopher Columbus Park. So this is the park right next to the Long Wharf Marriott, right on the water, and not an area that gets a whole lot of wave action because it's actually pretty protected. And this storm actually missed high tide by 3 hours, and that was the impact of that storm on it. And that's just water coming over the banks. So that's Christopher Columbus Park. Long Wharf at high tide in 2011. This is the other side of Christopher Columbus Park. That's just in what we like to call a wicked high tide. Which is our spring full moon high tides. And then Sandy. And as the mayor said last night, we didn't miss Sandy by 100 miles. We missed Sandy by 6 hours. Right? If it had hit 5.5 hours earlier during our high tide, we would have had a 100-year flooding event here. That's the magnitude of that type of storm. And that is one of the challenges for public-private partnerships and for intergovernmental partnerships. When you have storms that big, the calls that have to go out for mutual aid that we rely on for storms that large have to go further out geographically. We can't call New York and Connecticut and New Jersey for help with a storm of that size because it's impacting them as well. And so we need to start having better coordination, regionally better coordination from a larger scale for how we react to storms like that. So this was a miss, right? The one on, the pictures on the right there, and that's Morrissey Boulevard, another, city-state issue. Many of our roads in Boston, our boulevards, and many of our bridges are actually state-owned. So in terms of getting better prepared from a state infrastructure and a city infrastructure perspective, we need more coordination. So this is a map of looking at what happens with major events and what happens with sea level rise. So the dark blue is actually showing mean high water plus 5 feet. So this is the areas that would have been impacted had Sandy hit at high tide. It would have impacted about 6% of our waterfront, including the financial district, lapping up to where we are right now today. Spalding would have had water around its base, would have still been able to be operating because of how smartly it was designed, but would have been dealing with water on that area. You can see the South Boston Innovation District. You can see water in East Boston near the airport. If I had a laser, I would point this out. And then the lighter blue is plus 2.5 feet of sea level rise. So as I talked about, that is a reasonable hopeful expectation by 2070, 2080, that we only have about 2 feet of sea level rise. So that's a Sandy hitting with 2 feet of sea level rise with not doing anything. So we have our work to do. That said, so that's the last of the scary slides. That said, we've been working on this issue since 2007. This was part of my previous boss, Mayor Menino. This is part of his climate action plan from the get-go, was in terms of addressing climate preparedness. We need to manage the unavoidable and with as much effort and attention as avoiding the unmanageable. And what I mean by that is we need to be able to focus on reducing our greenhouse gas emissions as much as possible, because 6 feet of sea level rise is a game changer. But we also need to prepare for all of the pent-up climate change that is coming down at us, and we know is coming. It is going to take some effort to be able to deal with 2 feet of sea level rise going forward. We've been working on our, and I like to bucket this by infrastructure, neighborhoods, and buildings, but first talk about the lenses of how to prepare for climate change. There are really two issues here. One is preparing for, when it comes to coastal issues and storm surge, one is preparing for major wet weather events like a Sandy, so preparing for the storms, and that is a near-term top priority for the city and the state. The second is preparing for the twice-a-day high tides at the end of century that look like flooding events from those once-in-a-100-year storms today. There is a different set of solutions that needs to be discussed and evaluated to deal with that type of storm being twice-a-day high tide. So that said, there are really three buckets that we look at it within the city, and they each require varying levels of public-private partnership and partnership between different levels of government. At the infrastructure level, this is the one that requires inherently the most partnership with our state, federal, and regional authorities. As I mentioned, much of the infrastructure in Boston is owned or controlled by state and federal authorities. We've been working with the Boston Water and Sewer Commission, which is an independent city commission, for the last several years. They're about 2/3 of the way through a 25-year asset management plan and capital plan. they know that they're at the end of every major stormwater pipeline. We are the outlet water for most of Eastern Mass goes through Boston. 3 major rivers, the Mystic, the Neponset, and the Charles, and all of this is gravity fed. So if the stormwater pipes in Boston Harbor wind up below the high tide, the system backs up. Right? It's not particularly complicated. The solutions are expensive. And we need to make sure we have tide gates. Frankly, when we present the images of flooding in New York post-Sandy, what scares them the most is the subterranean flooding. Right? The largest issues actually in Manhattan were water going through existing infrastructure subterranean into buildings' basements and then coming up. That's not reflected in any of your FEMA flood maps. Right? FEMA just does surface flooding on top of, coming from the ocean or the river on top of your ground level. The subterranean is equally, if not more, dangerous. Local energy assurance. Our energy infrastructure in Massachusetts is controlled by the state DPU, our ISO New England, and federal authorities through FERC. We need to make sure it is better prepared, it is more resilient. We have a complete streets program, which was a public-private partnership to rethink how we design our streets for mobility, not for moving cars, for moving people, and doing so in a way that is faster, healthier, and cleaner. At the neighborhood scale, we are looking at things that involve neighborhood solutions. So beyond building solutions, do you look at tree planting and canopy coverage? As I talked about, it is absolutely critical we deal with urban heat island. Planting trees has a multitude of benefits. It's a stormwater management strategy. It cools the houses, cools the streets. We have a hazard mitigation plan that allows us to tap into federal funding and keeping that active. A great partnership with the Boston Harbor Association on sea level rise. They produce phenomenal research that pushes the envelope of the discussion and the discourse and allows the city to work with all of our private partners to develop the policies that get us there. You need robust nonprofit organizations to help keep the discourse in the public high and to educate folks and make the science talk sidewalk talk. And then lastly, at the buildings is inherently a public-private partnership. We are fortunate in Boston that many of our major building owners are long-term players and are here for the get-go. I actually come from the developer world and worked for Boston Properties, and that's one of those companies that when they build a building, they expect to own it forever. When you have that mentality in the private sector around real estate, that allows you to think differently because that problem in 2050 is their problem. It's not the next buyer's problem. But it is absolutely critical that cities and states partner with the private sector to make sure that we're not only looking at the next quarter, we're looking at the next quarter century. We developed, and actually, and to mention sort of the partnership stuff, we developed a climate preparedness questionnaire about a year and a half ago for all major new developments. We piloted it voluntarily and then formally adopted it into our BRA review guidelines in November. So every major project that comes before the City of Boston now, so any project over 20,000 square feet, has to answer a survey for how they're prepared for their predicted life cycle. So if you're building a 1 million square foot office tower, I expect you to be prepared for climate change for the next 70 to 80 years. Don't show me that your building is prepared 5 years from now. Show me that it's prepared 70 years from now in the conditions that we'll help you describe based on your site. So some of the stuff we've been doing, and I've mentioned some of this, so I'll move quickly through this. We had a climate preparedness task force in-house in City Hall. I invite folks to go to our website. We released in 2013 a citywide, for municipal services, a climate vulnerability assessment. I'm very pleased, and Mark is here, or Senator Pacheco is here, the first joint press conference between my mayor, Mayor Marty Walsh, and Governor Patrick, the first week of Mayor Walsh's tenure on the job, was at the aquarium to announce the state's response, which thankfully looked pretty similar to what we had done, which was requiring all city agencies to do an assessment of their vulnerability to climate change and release that within the next year. You can't manage what you don't measure and know about. And the first step in this is vulnerability assessments and being transparent, right? We have our vulnerabilities. It's okay to share them. We can't address them until we actually assess them and make them public and prioritize them. And the public expects that. The Green Ribbon Commission, which I know Vivian Lee will talk more about, a phenomenal private sector group. The highlight to me is many cities and towns and states will create a leadership private sector group to create their climate action plans. That's not enough. You need to keep that group around to actually help you implement. So the Green Ribbon Commission is 30 plus or minus C-suite level private sector folks from our real estate industry, our medical institutions, our educational institutions, our major trades, and our developer institutions and civic institutions to help us implement our plan. And they sign on for 3-year terms. and we meet a couple of times a year, and they own the implementation of the city's climate action plan, both from a mitigation and a preparedness perspective. Why is this critical? From a mitigation perspective, if I add up the greenhouse gas emissions from all the city buildings and all the city services, it's about 2.5% of the city's community-wide greenhouse gas emissions. The city government can cease to exist, and we won't even reach our 2020 goals of 25% reduction. So that's on the mitigation side. And on the preparedness side, as I hope I'm conveying, we control some of our destiny. The private sector needs to be a partner in getting this city better prepared. So the Green Ribbon Commission has a working group focused on climate preparedness and adaptation. This past summer, they issued a great report on things that existing buildings can do in partnership with the Boston Society of Architects, that existing buildings can do to get better prepared for coastal storms. And that report is public as well on the Green Ribbon Commission's website. We're assessing vulnerabilities, as I mentioned. We actually sent out a survey through the BRA to existing waterfront buildings, asking them what they're doing to get an assessment of best practices so we can create a guideline of best practices. And I was talking with Hubert last night, we want to do this again. Many building owners in Boston have done a lot of work and strategy post-Sandy to better assess their vulnerabilities and reduce them. And let's start keeping that alive and active in terms of best practices. New buildings, I had mentioned, we now have climate preparedness questionnaire and requirements in our Article 80 guidelines. We're looking within our wetlands ordinance at new floodplain maps, as I'm sure has been, and a new local wetlands ordinance. As I'm sure has been discussed in your cities and towns, the new FEMA maps are having a profound effect on the public discourse. There are certainly challenges when we talk about insurance rates. The reality is the FEMA maps themselves, even if accurate, are still backwards looking. Right? They do not incorporate any of what we talk about in terms of climate change. So at best, they are better looking backwards maps for next year's 100-year storm event. They are not planning tools for how we design our cities and our states. And then lastly, we need to make sure that our emergency operations planning is adapted to these new realities. The pictures of Morrissey Boulevard flooding, that's a state-appointed evacuation route. So that evacuation route will work for an earthquake. It may work for a major snow event that's not at a high tide. It will not work for a hurricane, right? So we need to make sure that we have adapted our major evacuation routes for those types of things. You guys saw this. We love Spalding. I just keep this slide in there. It is still the best example that we have in the city of a building that, and this was stressed a little bit, but this building needs to be in operation during the worst of the worst storms. It can't button down and seal up and not operate. Hospitals and the healthcare industry is on such a thin margin. There is not these extra beds in the region that we can send folks to. Right? So these buildings need to be designed to be operating during the storm, which is very different than many private sector buildings that you button them up, the people aren't coming in, you can tighten up your garage, folks aren't coming. This needs to be operating. And I think the best part for me is that this building can operate even if its first floor winds up being impacted and inundated. We're in the midst of our climate action plan update, and I mentioned where we were in 2007. All these are public documents. I'm happy to share them, and they're up on our website. We're in the midst of our update. We require a climate action plan update every 3 years, and that process is kicking off right now. We'll be releasing that towards the end of 2014. Climate preparedness is a key focus of this year's update, both near term and starting to think about long term. I'd mentioned the Green Ribbon Commission. Its role is really to advise, engage, and highlight. And the monikers and the labels you see on the slide, those are the executives of those institutions are the members. So the head of Partners Healthcare, Gary Gottlieb, is a member. The president of Harvard University, the president of Suffolk Construction, the chairman of Beacon Capital. You need that level of C-suite buy-in for public-private partnerships to make them work. And that gets the top level of attention. The co-chairs of the Green Ribbon Commission are Amos Hofstetter, who was the founder of Cablevision and is a major philanthropic player in Boston, and the mayor of Boston. And it has transitioned from Mayor Menino, who founded it, to Mayor Walsh, and he grabbed the torch in November, right after he won election, and said this is exactly the type of group and engagement we need to continue. And that helps you have that conversation through electoral cycles, which is absolutely important for an issue that we're going to be faced with decades ahead. Two reports that highlight that are available again on our website. Building Resilience in Boston, which I mentioned that the Boston Society of Architects did. That was through our Green Ribbon Commission Climate Preparedness Working Group. Best practices for Boston, but very replicable to probably many of your states and municipalities. And then Climate Ready Boston is the vulnerability assessment I mentioned that we released in October. Has spreadsheets tied to it identifying specific buildings and assets that we need to spend some time making less vulnerable. For example, we looked at where our emergency shelters are located. Turns out if Sandy had hit at high tide, all 3 of our designated emergency shelters in East Boston were in the flood zone, right? So some of that is how do we make sure that we have one that is outside of the flood zone? And some of that may just be designating, there's a high school up on a hill that could be designated as the emergency shelter instead of all 3 in the flood zone. So reevaluating the types of hazards we expect to happen going forward and making sure our emergency plans are adapted accordingly. The slide on the left is courtesy of 350.org, another what if we do nothing scenario. We will have a lot more water-based transportation. So the MBTA may look like the ferry system in Sydney. And then on the right, obviously the top right, wicked high tides. We're facing this today. It does not take a storm, and that is a real sign. We put those out on Morrissey Boulevard during our spring moon high tides. It does not take a major storm in Boston to have a serious flooding event. Right? It's lunar cycles. So we've been dealing with this for a while, which hopefully gets the mindset better ready to be prepared. And then on the bottom right, just highlighting the necessity of partnerships across levels of government. That's Manhattan during Sandy. And you can see the dark spots there. One of the solutions that we are pushing in Boston is district energy. District energy proved to be invaluable to the areas, to the institutions, mostly medical and Battery Park City to an extent, and mostly medical and university, keeping the lights on. Oftentimes, the conversation around district energy and combined heat and power has been cost reduction. That to me is a drop in the bucket in terms of the value. If you ask these institutions what was it worth to have their power on for the week post-Sandy as opposed to being out, astronomical value in keeping those experiments going and keeping their businesses operating. District energy has to be part of the solution. I don't control that destiny. Even though when the power goes out in Boston, I'm the first person that people call, I have zero regulatory authority over NSTAR. It is a state issue, it is a regional issue, and it is a federal issue, and we need to work in partnership across those bounds. And I think that's my 20 minutes. Sorry, I talked a little fast.
We started him late. But Brian talked fast, so he got through an awful lot of data. We are cheating slightly, but can we cheat for a question or two? All right, we're going to cheat a little bit. Questions?
Joan Fitzgerald, Northeastern University. I guess it is. My question has to do with process. So you talk a lot about the need for state government coordination, regional, where there's really not government entities to deal with. Can you say a little bit about how this is occurring both in Boston and Massachusetts and maybe in some of the other states where
Sure.
Does it just happen because you have good relationships? How do you build that kind of coordination?
So in Massachusetts, we're working on a request to the governor to do some more convening between city authorities and state authorities regionally, and we're looking at this. And you heard the messaging from Mayor Walsh last night about thinking more regionally, that Boston, this issue does not respect municipal boundaries, it doesn't respect state boundaries. So we'll be looking in the near future to more closely collaborate with the state in those discussions. Another aspect of this coordination is identifying other cities and other states that are facing similar issues and similar solution sets. In January, at our request, we found some foundation funding to convene a 5 cities post-Sandy analysis in New York. So I got together and I brought a team of 5 folks, and each of the cities did, with New York, Baltimore, Philadelphia, and Newark, New Jersey, and did a post-Sandy analysis of what's working, what's not, and a FEMA map update analysis. There are actually 3 different FEMA regions, all operating shockingly differently across those 5 cities with different sets of rules and different standards. So we all got together for the first time around a specific issue. As focus is sea level rise, storm surge, and the FEMA maps. That was an invaluable 2 days. So I encourage folks to not only think about geographically in terms of your regions, but identifying government bodies that are facing similar issues to share best practices. We are all in this together. And it was, simple things. New York had already spent the money through a federal FEMA grant to translate some of the flood map guidance into 9 different languages. I don't need to then spend the same money up here in Boston to translate the same guidelines into 9 languages if they're willing to share that with me. So how do we collaborate more effectively across similar governmental entities for the same issues?
Yes. And yeah, go ahead.
Well, thank you.
The back.
Denise Provo, I represent Somerville, which is just over there. And in the last 2 days, I have lost any complacency that I would have felt about looking at the new FEMA maps. And listening to you, there's even more cause for concern. What is the best way to come up with flood maps that show the subterranean flooding and the storm surge potential flooding, and not the sort of retrospective normal level flooding that the FEMA maps represent?
So the best way that we have found is the authorities that control that infrastructure that's underground are the ones that are most intimately concerned about it. So in Boston, Boston Water and Sewer Commission is doing a full-fledged study of the impacts of sea level rise and storm surge on their stormwater infrastructure. So I'd encourage you to start with your stormwater authorities. And then Department of Transportation, the State Department of Transportation is doing work on their tunnels and assessing flood impacts on their tunnels in the subterranean, so they're a good source as well. There is, given New England and Boston, there is a small subset of consultants that have a deep expertise in this type of issue, and their willingness to build on models that they're developing for other city and state agencies has been very helpful. And you're absolutely right, part of the challenge of these new FEMA maps is that while everyone is concerned about the insurance impact, they don't actually convey the risk of flooding. Right? They convey whether or not you have to get insurance next year based on surface flooding. And so part of the challenge that I have and my colleagues in positions in other governments have is that this doesn't become, oh, I'm outside of that line, I'm safe. Right? And as we saw in New York and New Jersey, many of those neighborhoods had what they thought at the time was the equivalent of an 800-year flooding event. It wasn't really an 800-year flooding event, it just was not accurately conveyed to them the risk that they were facing.
Over here.
So I'm interested to hear. Well, okay, I'm
Yep.
interested to hear. It's great to hear about the collaboration with other cities and regional, and obviously the state's got to be a player. Beyond FEMA and the mapping, because that's a problem. I'm from Vermont. Deb Markowitz from our Agency of Natural Resources. So mapping is, and the backward-looking rather than forward-looking is a real problem. Is there a way that you think the feds could better engage with this, particularly maybe HUD or the Energy Department? And, what would your wish list be for them coming to the table in a way that would be more productive and more collaborative?
Yep. So as you know, because your governor is on the task force, there is a White House convened task force on climate preparedness. I have floated in some ideas, even though we weren't invited to be on the task force. Happens when you're in an electoral transition. We didn't take it as a snub. I told them I'll still be around, and they said, we'll wait and see. Oh, good. So the idea that I floated, which I think would go a long way to this, the president announced, I think a couple of weeks ago, the creation of climate preparedness hubs within the Department of Agriculture in about 7 cities, mostly Midwestern sort of farm states. Can we have the same thing for coastal regions? And the idea is, and this is revenue neutral, but the idea is a collaborating entity, a single federal government point source to deal with HUD, FEMA, EPA, Department of Interior, Department of Energy, that convenes all of the preparedness resources, research, grant programs in one-stop shop for urban coastal resiliency. And so that was my single sort of most important request that I floated into Gina McCarthy and other folks. And if we got everybody in the room to push for that, I bet we could get it. So.
Yeah, one more. Sorry, I was sleeping here.
It's not a question, but just a follow-up, because I think it was important with Joan's question, is that, what Boston is doing is really leadership in terms of the Northeast here, with the major cities, in terms of preparing, and they've been working on this for a little while. But the question also went to what the partnership with the state. And as you heard the mayor announce last night, the mayor and the governor had a press conference on the $52 million. They were looking at the most vulnerable areas to go forward. But we in the legislature have filed legislation to mandate that any administration, going forward, would have a comprehensive vulnerability analysis that's updated, and it's a cross-silo looking at not only the coastal regions, but also the inland regions. And I know that there are some people that have been interested in it. I thought it was timely to bring it up right now, seeing as though that question was mentioned. But the legislation was actually, developed in part with the cooperation of organizations like Mass Audubon and other groups that have been very, very interested in adaptive adaptation policy, resiliency, et cetera. So it's a baseline. It hasn't even had a hearing yet, so the legislation will change, and we will be better informed as we go forward through the process of enacting this legislation. But we want to have, as part of the comprehensive system, to have it in law, so that we can make sure that no matter which administration is there in the future, that we are really, really doing everything we can to work with, progressive cities like Boston and others.
Great. And I would just close, I know we got to keep on moving on, and the mayor mentioned this last night, the question of capital, right? When you guys go back to your government entities, people are going to say, how much does this cost? That's the wrong question, right? How much does it cost to take no action? And the reality is we all spend billions of dollars in capital projects every year. We need to make sure that we're taking advantage of every opportunity within that existing capital stream to make our cities and our states less vulnerable. And so that means the state's capital process in terms of having an evaluation methodology to make sure we're not adding to the problem, we're actually reducing the problem, and the city's capital projects. Before you get to the additional funds that are proactive, let's make sure we're building everything going forward that's going to have a life cycle of, most of our significant assets have significantly long life cycles, that we are building it with thoughtfulness to the climate in front of us. And that we need to change that paradigm. You will face that same question in the public-private partnership realm from your private sector partners, right, from the real estate entities. And it's not spend new money, it's designed smartly. When you're replacing your HVAC system or your transformer, is it located in the right place? Is now the time to move it? And it's those types of questions that we need to have now. We have a small window of opportunity in terms of our capital cycle to get the infrastructure in place for 2050 and beyond in the next 10 years. And that's where, I don't want to be here 20 years from now looking back saying, I wish we hadn't built that in that location, or I wish we had raised that. So thank you guys for having me.
Thank you very much.